Okay, so we're in chapter 10, which is, apparently I have a security alert, okay, which is gender, expectations, roles, behaviors. This is one of those topics that over the years I've been teaching human sexuality has suddenly and abruptly gotten way more complex than it once was. So I've really expanded my discussion of this topic compared to what I was doing even 5 years ago. So what I'm hoping to do is to sort of give a well-balanced, you know, presentation of all the things that we know, and I'm not trying to introduce anything controversial or anything politically oriented or anything like that. This is, trying to give you information so that you can make your own decisions, not me trying to defend or assert any particular position. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is make a distinction between what the word sex means and what the word gender means. Of course, we've been using the word sex throughout this class to mean, sexual activity, doing things pleasurably, but there's also, sex is one of those English words that has more than one meaning, right? So when we talk about sex in this context, a lot of times we'll go ahead and say biological sex. Maybe that makes it make more sense, that what we're talking about is all the characteristics that come from our biology, all the behaviors, the likes, the dislikes, and things like that that might be attributable to our biology. So the factors that go into our biology would be our chromosomes, which gonads we have, what our hormone pattern looks like, not only now, but also what it looked like in the womb, and what it looked like when we were going through childhood, and what it looked like when we were going through puberty. And then finally, what our genitals look like. So there are a lot of different things. Not all of these things have to agree with each other, by the way. So we're going to talk about that. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is the gender side. Gender is usually the simple definition of gender is it's the socialized side of masculinity, femininity. Differences that we see between males and females oftentimes are attributable to their gender. That is how they've been taught they should act or what they've been taught they should like. So we've got biology, which is oftentimes what we were born with, but also that can be influenced by environmental factors. And then we've got gender, which is thought to be largely driven by socialization, but also could be partially influenced by biological sex factors. So let's get into that. Okay, so where does our biological sex come from? Well, let's start with chromosomal sex. So as we've discussed before, XY versus XX. We've got XY, usually the presence of the Y leads to male characteristics, and the absence of that Y, and indeed the presence of the second X, will typically lead to feminine characteristics. So the thing to remember is that when mom is contributing DNA to her offspring, all she has to offer is X's, right? Because she's made up of two X's. Whereas dad could offer an X or he could offer a Y to his offspring. So mom is always going to donate the X and dad is going to donate either an X or a Y. If dad donates an X, we've got a girl baby. If dad donates a Y, then we have a boy baby. So a lot of times people like to phrase it as, dad determines the chromosomal sex of the baby because mom always contributes the same things. Where it gets kind of interesting, I'm in a really sunny room, so I can't even see my own arrows. So if you can't see my arrows, there are arrows. If you look at the XX baby that's on the far left, you've got an arrow going from the X from the dad, and then an arrow going from the first X of the mom. And then when you look at the XY baby, you've got an arrow coming down from the dad's Y, and an arrow coming from the first X from the mom. So that's one way that the chromosomes might match up. The other way is that dad could donate his one X and mom could donate, maybe it's best if you can't see the arrows because the arrows should be coming from the other X, because mom might donate her other X and pair up with dad's X, so that we have actually a slightly different chromosomal pattern in sisters who received their either one or the other of mom's X chromosomes. So now I've got the correct arrow coming down on the right hand X for mom. So both of the babies on the right should have their mom's X coming from that far right. And it just kind of illustrates that you could get boys and girls made up by, an X or a Y from dad and either of mom's X's. And so when you see differences, for example, between sisters, it could be partly attributable to the fact that they got one or the other of mom's X's. They always got the same X from dad. Okay, and then it's also notable that there are things that can be attached to the X chromosome, like hemophilia, like color blindness. There are what we call sex-linked disorders, things that are carried on the X chromosome. So if you have a boy baby, dad gave him his Y, mom gave him an X. If that boy baby has hemophilia, you know it came down on mom's X. She may not have hemophilia, but she's a carrier and was able to donate that X to her baby boy, and he expressed the trait because he only has the one X. So that's one of the really important things about chromosomal sex, is that a lot of times boys will display characteristics that are X-linked much more likely than girls will, because girls have two X's, and if one of them has a code that's not advantageous, it'll be turned off and masked by her other X. So let's talk about some chromosomal sex abnormalities. Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome occurs when you have a baby who's born with two X's and one Y. Now, normally you only have two chromosomes at that 23rd position, but occasionally a third chromosome gets in there. Maybe when the egg was being designed, it didn't fully divide in half, and so that extra X got left. Or when the sperm was being created, it didn't get fully divided. In this case, it would have to be the extra Y, because sperm, there's no way there'd be a Y present unless the sperm was carrying it. So you have a sperm that has a Y plus an extra X that doesn't belong. This is one of those levels of the DNA where if you have a third chromosome present, you can still live. There are certain positions on your DNA that if you have a third chromosome, you can't live. You can still live, but you're going to have symptoms. So with Klinefelter syndrome, you see all these characteristics that at puberty will emerge and make it really clear that there is a second X interfering with the action of the Y. So breast development, the hips will widen, all these things that are mentioned here. One of the side effects of having Klinefelter syndrome is that oftentimes the person will be infertile, because one of the things that happens when you have too many X chromosomes is that it's difficult to correctly divide up your own cells, your own gametes, to be able to make offspring. So usually they'll be infertile. Now, there are some personality characteristics that oftentimes go along with Klinefelter syndrome, and one of the things that we aren't clear on, psychology has to admit those things that we don't really know yet and we can't really parse out, is whether having these physical characteristics makes the person feel shy, makes the person want to withdraw, or if those personality characteristics are a function of the chromosomal abnormality. So we're not really sure. We just know that on average they're more timid and withdrawn. Almost all chromosomal sex abnormalities will be accompanied by some degree of learning disability. That learning disabilities are defined as having normal intelligence but being behind in either math or reading. And so this doesn't mean that they have low IQ necessarily, just that they have difficulty with certain aspects of cognition. And then, like I said, typically a person with Klinefelter syndrome will be sterile. So that's Klinefelter syndrome. Then we have other chromosomal abnormalities. This one, I'm not sure if this is the real name for it. If you Google Superman syndrome, you may not find what I'm talking about. This is the term that I was taught that it's called, because a person with this syndrome has two Ys and one X. And so they call it Superman because you got like extra Ys, so you get extra masculine characteristics. A person with XYY, you see sort of the flip from Klinefelter syndrome. You have a very confident personality, sometimes to the point of what you call antisocial personality, where they don't necessarily feel like they have to follow rules. Rules and norms are for suckers. Everybody else has to follow the rules, but this person doesn't have to. So it might be so confident that they get overly confident, maybe what you might call cocky. Maybe even you might call it callous. Again, with the learning disability. So there's something to, there's something going on with the incorrect number of chromosomes being present that's affecting the way that the person is thinking and processing information. And now, interestingly, with 3 chromosomes, the second Y, for some reason, this doesn't seem to cause the sterility problems that having the second X does for the Klinefelter male. So either the extra testosterone and things that are present with the second Y compensate. It's not really clear why, but you could go your whole life with Superman syndrome and not have any idea that you have it. Whereas a person with Klinefelter syndrome will be diagnosed usually at puberty when they realize that things are developing differently than they should have. Now, things that go along with Superman syndrome and that extra Y is they'll tend to have greasier than normal skin after puberty. They'll have a lot of hair in their skin, a heavy beard growth, maybe hair on their backs, stuff like that. They tend to be taller than average. They tend to have bigger muscle mass than average. So there are certain characteristics that go along with it. But, a lot of males have greasy skin or acne or a lot of hair or lots of muscles, and so it's really hard to tell unless you actually had a DNA test whether you actually have Superman syndrome. And most people wouldn't even have a need to get a DNA test because nothing's really significantly wrong. Now, Turner syndrome is a disorder where you have one X chromosome and nothing else, no partner for that X chromosome. And so here's a drawing of sort of some of the stuff that goes along with Turner syndrome. You have the shorter stature. On average, they're much less than 5 feet tall. I think the average is something like 4'6". And then you see like a shortened neck that's got webbing. They'll have usually heart problems. Their arms are short. I mean, you see certain kinds of physical characteristics that can cue that the person has Turner syndrome. Today they have pretty good treatments. If a person is diagnosed with Turner syndrome, they start them on estrogen treatment pretty early so that they'll grow taller, and there are treatments for the heart and other kinds of things. And so a lot of times you won't have such dramatic symptoms as was once the case in the olden days. One characteristic that seems to go along with Turner syndrome is that they have difficulty reading emotions, which sometimes can be a symptom of high-functioning autism. So it's not really clear whether this is something that is what we call a comorbid diagnosis, or if it's something that happens on its own just as a function of Turner syndrome. Again, learning disabilities are fairly common, and they will be infertile. The ovaries tend to not fully develop in the absence of that second X chromosome, so typically can't carry children. Even with the estrogen treatments and those kinds of things, you're generally going to end up with infertility as a lifelong problem. Okay, now I linked in our classroom to this video that shows a little girl who has Turner syndrome, and she was adopted by a mom who has Turner syndrome, and the treatments that she's going through and stuff. Okay, so chromosomal sex. So what we think happens with our chromosomes is that they trigger the functioning of the hypothalamus while still in the womb even, and that hypothalamus activity in response to either the presence or the absence of the Y chromosome leads to specific functioning of the anterior pituitary gland, which we talked about before when we talked about menstrual cycles. The anterior pituitary in turn activates the adrenal glands, what we call the adrenal cortex, to release cortisol, and that provides a feedback loop to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So what we think happens is that our DNA in the womb sets up this feedback loop of hormones and neurotransmitters that either masculinize or feminize the brain. So chromosomal sex is the beginning, and then it starts a cascade of other stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll start with the next level of the cascade, which would be chromosomal sex leading to gonadal sex.